Hello, it's Blue Orange 22. You know, something that I can't help but think about when I think of feminism and men's rights and the whole debate on gender equality is how the modern day feminist movement really started becoming like mainstream and really kind of began in the 60s, the mid to late 60s, when the Vietnam War and the draft was going on. And of course, during the Vietnam War, it's only men that were drafted. Now, first of all, just to be clear, I don't blame feminists for the Vietnam War or for the draft. And I know that the vast majority of feminist movements back in the 60s were against the war. I know that. I do blame feminists for supporting the draft in World War I. That was called the White Feather Campaign. I put a link to that in the description below, but that's for a separate video. So right now, I'm just going to talk about the Vietnam War. And it's just kind of crazy to me how when we talk about gender equality in the United States over the last few decades, we completely forget about the fact that not that long ago, 18-year-old boys were drafted and forced into the military against their will, sent overseas to fight, and thousands of them were dead, killed forever. And yet, not only do we not really remember that, like when we talk about, oh well, you know, men in the workplace were privileged in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, but those men had to go through a draft. And feminists in the 60s were watching as their young male peers were being forced into battle, but they really felt like they were the ones being purely discriminated against. Like, you know, didn't they kind of notice that, well, it's kind of a huge advantage that we don't have to go and fight and die? Because honestly, what is worse than death? And the draft is something that still affects men alive today. There are still men in their 60s and 70s who suffer from, you know, chronic pain, permanent disability, permanent injury, permanent emotional trauma because of the war that they were drafted into. And it's like though we never factor that into the debate on gender equality. You know, I mean, you could probably do a whole subject, a whole debate or a whole essay, a whole speech, whatever, on how male veterans of the Vietnam War are still suffering. And what makes it a men's rights issue especially is that they were drafted. They were forced into the war against their will because of their gender. And yet we talk about gender discrimination and unfair gender roles. And it's like feminists kind of completely ignore that. Most people kind of completely ignore that. You know, so I understand a 19-year-old girl in 1967 felt like, you know, she was fighting for equal rights. You know, she was fighting because she wants to be seen as an equal in the workplace. She wants to be seen as equal in, you know, university and school. She wants to be seen as equal in society. Okay, I agree with that. That's fine. But, I mean, really, what was worse for 19-year-olds in 1967? Not being treated equally in the workplace, or hiding behind a tree and then suddenly stop existing for all eternity because a bullet hit you in the head? You know? And that's just like, it's a whole half of the conversation that it's like people completely forget about and completely ignore. And it wasn't just that the draft was happening back in the 60s. Men are still being affected by the draft today. Men are still disabled physically and emotionally today. And 55,000 men aren't alive at all because they were killed. And I think when you're talking about equality and the history of gender discrimination and gender privilege and male privilege in the United States over the last 40, 50 years, how can you ignore that?